Hi everyone, this is Jerry. This is a game from the London Chess Classic 2010. After 5 rounds of play, the current leaders are Magnus Carlsen, Vishy Anand, and Luke McShane, all having 9 points. And how the point system works for this particular tournament is that if you win your game, you get 3 points towards your tournament total. A draw is worth 1 point, and a loss, you get nothing. So this particular game between Vishy Anand playing the white side versus Magnus Carlsen, black, is from round 3, so let's have a look. Vishy opening up with 1e4, Carlsen e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, so we have the Ruy Lopez, a6, bishop back, and now knight f6. All very standard stuff, white castles, bishop e7, and rook to e1. So already at this point we sidestep one of the possibilities, one of the variations that we could see out of the Ruy Lopez, the Berlin defense. We're past that stage. b5, bishop back, and pawn to d6. After pawn to d6, we're also avoiding any martial attack, which could come by way of, if black castled, c3 could be met with d5. So we're not entering that line of play either. Instead, what we do go into is d6, c3, black castles, h3, and now knight back to b8. This signals the Breyer variation of the Ruy Lopez. One other quick point to make is that h3 is necessary to prevent this bishop to g4 move. If you do d4 right away, bishop g4 will come. Pressure on the knight essentially means that the tension, any tension in the center, will be resolved right away. So white doesn't want to allow that to occur. So h3 first, knight back to b8, and only now d4. Knight d7, getting it back into play, adding support to the e5 pawn. And now just more development. Knight on b to d2. Followed by bishop to b7. One quick point to make is that while this knight's journey likes to be by way of f1, g3, eyeing the f5 square, another thing that black likes to do is play rook f8 followed by bishop f8. Or excuse me, rook to e8 followed by bishop to f8. But it's important that black does not make this rook move right away, because that will end up losing material by way of bishop takes on f7. And you're essentially losing your rook at this point in the game. The best move would maybe be to just play king here. If you take the bishop, you're going to end up, well, your queen is going to end up watching the game from the sidelines. So knight e6, and then the queen is cooked. So that's just one thing to be aware of. You don't play rook e8 at this point, but first bishop b7. And what does this do exactly? Well, it puts immediate pressure on white's center. And by doing that, you're preventing white from making this rerouting type of maneuver, knight f1 to g3. So the knight can't move now because there's not enough supporters for this e-pawn. So bishop c2, lending support for this pawn. Rook e8 now, and now a4. So what is this rook doing? Well, indirectly, there's still a couple pieces between the rook and this pawn, but it's indirectly putting pressure on this e4 pawn. a4, striking at this b5 pawn and also making way for the rook to do stuff after the capture on b5. Bishop back. Now the rook is that much more influential to the center of the board. And we have bishop to d3. You really don't want to capture at this point right here. There's no need to capture away from the center unless you have a really good reason. One thing that you could see as a direct result of capturing away from the center, you'll note that c4 is no longer protected. Maybe knight c4 could come about doing a couple things. One, adding more pressure to e5, and also getting ready to be very annoying to this bishop. Knight a5 would really cause this bishop a headache. So that's why we're not going to want to do this as black, but instead just regroup, allow this rook to have more influence on the position. Bishop d3, what is this doing? Well, just from c2, it's really just functioning in one way. It's doing one thing, just watching over its pawn. What is it doing now coming to d3? It's essentially changing itself into a multi-purpose piece, doing two things. Now there's pressure against this pawn as well as defense of this pawn. c6 is played now to add a defender to this pawn. Again, you really don't want to have this, you really don't want to flinch with this pawn. You just want to maintain its position. So that's why we're seeing c6. Pawn to b4, allowing this pawn to contribute to some control of the, some more control of the black queenside squares, a5 and c5. If c5 comes about, well, it might be a bit more difficult maybe to play this c5 advance, but also just vacating this b2 square for the bishop. Rook to c8, anticipating the capture on the b5 square, and then this rook would have direct pressure against this kind of awkwardly placed pawn. It's kind of just backward, and we have this weakened square c4 on the white side here. So pawn takes, pawn, c takes pawn, and now bishop to b2. So these rooks are ideally placed. The center could really open up after pawn takes pawn here. This rook would be contributing to more pressure against e4. And now d5 right away. After this move right here, there's a whole lot of tension in the center. It doesn't get any more tense than this sort of situation where either side, you know, depending on whose ever move it is, we could see many different captures going on. This is really where a lot of thought has to be placed into the game whenever there's possibilities for the change in a pawn structure. Are your pieces going to be in a position to do well with that change in the pawn structure? The pawns essentially act as your home. So if you don't have like a nice home structurally, then things might not be too great. d5, another reason for maybe playing this d5 move right now is because if black doesn't play d5, you may very well see white taking the opportunity to play d5 himself. For example, let's just say g6 is played maybe to get this bishop on this long diagonal. d5 is a space gaining move, and we could see maybe white trying to get this c4 advance in at this point. And when that move does come about, this pawn may very well find itself, well, black may find it very difficult to maybe go ahead and defend this a6 pawn. And maybe there's possibilities of knight someday maybe hopping to this c6 square, which is a very sensitive square in the black position, which could possibly come about if we had this sort of change in the pawn structure and this c pawn were to advance to c4. But we don't get into that. Black doesn't even allow white to have this possibility to just gain some space with d5, but instead we see d5 by black, d5, and now we have the exchange of e takes d, and we have an exchange of rooks prior to this c4 advance. There was some time spent at this point by Vishy. If you try to do this c4 move right away, well, now maybe it's a bit awkward to have your queen on e1 opposed to d1. You know, where do you think she's maybe going to be a bit better placed? Black was likely reasoning that it's better to just exchange rooks first prior to pushing c4, and that's exactly what we have. Rook takes rook, queen takes rook, and now c4. There's also possibilities of maybe taking on d4 with the pawn in a couple different ways, with the knight or pawn. If you take with the pawn, you could kind of discount that because you just lose a very important pawn on b5, because now you have a 2-0 majority on the queen side, and these doubled pawns really can't go too far. In fact, this pawn is toast very quickly. So that's why you wouldn't want to capture like this. And if you capture with the knight, well, after the knight captures here, now you're going to need a babysitter for the c3 pawn. Not a position you really want to be in. So that's why we're seeing at this point right here this c4 move, because you kind of just want to get rid of your own liability, and right now this c pawn right here is a liability. So let's get rid of that pawn, and we'll worry about recapturing on d4 later. So c4 takes, and then knight recaptures. Again, another instance, which of these two pieces does best to capture on this c4 square? Really the knight, because it's hard to argue a better diagonal for this bishop to be on. It's already very well placed from d3. So maybe the knight is better on this c4 square. So after knight takes on d5, this pawn is hit a couple times. There's no really, you really can't defend that pawn anymore. It's just kind of just going to fall. So what do you do in the meantime? You just grab this pawn. Once again, with what piece? Anand picks the knight because these two bishops are already very well placed. Two adjacent diagonals, very nice, aiming directly against black's king. We take with the knight because this knight really, ideally, would like to get to this f5 square. So we grab the pawn, and we're also making way to be in a better position with our knight. Knight takes on b, and we just go to f5 right away, allowing black to go ahead and take our bishop. After the queen recaptures, we see bishop to e4, forking these two pieces. So a great deal of calculation was played up until this point. Vishy most certainly had to know how exactly to reply to such a move. Another possibility from this point is queen to e6. This is actually a very critical point. After the bishop to e4, black starts to go a little bit downhill, and we enter a very torturous type of ending where white is essentially, well, black essentially has a bullseye on their back, and they're really just trying to save the game for a great number of moves. So we could see, instead of this bishop e4 move, this queen e6 move. And if the knight comes here, we could see rook to c5. If knight takes bishop, we would have rook takes knight. That's just one quick possibility. Although black is up material at this point, these knights are very well placed. This bishop, when you do a piece comparison, this bishop on f8 is probably not as well placed as the bishop on b2. And it's tough to really just get this passed pawn moving in such a position where there's still three minor pieces on each side. So what we did see, instead of queen e6 in the game, bishop to e4, and now queen to d4, forming a battery pressure against g7. After bishop takes knight, knight to d6, so the material will be regained at this point. There's no time to grab the knight because queen takes g7 would be mate. So instead, we have a bunch of pieces being hit by this knight. Queen, bishop, rook. What do? You move the queen out of the way and now grab this bishop. So even more pressure is now all of a sudden mounting on this g7 square, and Carlsen meets that threat with f6. This is always a bit of a scary move to make whenever there's still maybe a bishop on the board or a queen. In this case, there's not a light square bishop to be checking the black king, but of course the queen still is on the board, and you have to be very aware tactically whenever you open a diagonal towards your own king. So f6, it defends the threat against g7. That's its primary focus. So rook to d1, pressure is mounting against this d7 knight. Black is in a very difficult position at this point. The move played was rook to c2, but let's just take a quick look at one what if. What if rook to c7? I believe black might have discounted this as a result of queen check, king in the corner, and queen to f7, and maybe not have gone too much more into thinking at this point, because it's just kind of black is in just a giant knot, and there doesn't seem to be any convenient way to kind of untie it. You really can't move the knight to, let's say, e5 because of the one possible variation, just capturing the queen. After the queens come off, we would see this knight d6 move, just chasing a defender away from defense of the bishop. And soon enough, we're going to have just the loss of material. There's nothing to really do at this point. You can't move the rook because you'd get mated. Rook takes bishop is mate, so that this is just a losing variation. So that's why we're not maybe seeing just passive defense with rook to c7, but instead black gets a bit aggressive and plays, let's see, after rook plays rook c2, pressure against this bishop, and now we have this nice knight check move. This is a very sharp move, and it really ruins black's structure. After knight h6, you really can't refuse the capture of this knight, otherwise you're going to end up losing your queen. Knight f7 is a fork, so you kind of just have to take the knight, and as soon as you do that, you're opening yourself up to checks along this diagonal. So there's the black king is most certainly more vulnerable to the white king, and that's of great importance in this position here because the queens are still on the board, and so white does well as a result of the king's positions to keep the queens on the board, because the black king is more vulnerable to checks. So queen g4, bishop block, and we don't take this knight right away. Notice that the queen and the rook, either one could go ahead and grab the knight. Again, we wouldn't want to take with the queen, that's for sure, because we want to maintain the queens on the board. We could take with the rook. However, there's one thing we have to be careful about, and it's the possibility that black could actually go ahead and sack their queen. And after that sort of exchange, we could have an instance here where black maybe has the possibility of obtaining some sort of a fortress. What do I mean by that? Let me just give you a quick example. Let's just say maybe the rook moves to, or excuse me, the queen moves here. And I'm not saying that these are the most accurate moves right here, but just for instructional purposes, if black could obtain this sort of position right here. This is essentially going to be a fortress. Even if this pawn falls, what we could have from this point is this rook oscillating from f8 to f6, just going back and forth, or maybe even along this rank right here, and there's nothing that white could really do to make progress. If this king tries to maybe sneak up here, you'll notice that once it gets to h5, it can't make any further progress because this h7 pawn is here to watch over g6. That actually turns out to be of great importance. So for as long as this pawn is actually able to be maintained on the board, there's not going to be a way for white to really make progress. That's a finer detail of this position that's important to take note of, and that's why we're seeing at this point not the capture of this knight right away, but instead queen to e6 check. What does this do exactly? Well, it flushes the king to the corner, and now after rook takes knight, there's not this possibility of grabbing the rook, because after rook takes bishop here, you'll notice that the queen could give check followed by mate, whereas in the other position that bishop was already in position right here. If we go ahead and take the knight right away, this bishop from this position would be in position to go ahead and block the check successfully. So that's an important feature of this position. So some patience most certainly required. Very technical ideas being implemented right here. You give a check first, and only then grab the knight. And after rook takes knight, we have queen f8. Some time was spent at this point by Vishy, and the move that he came up with was bishop to a3, but there's a much quicker knockout, and it comes in the form of rook to f7, and after queen to b8 we would see rook to e7, and black is pretty much toast. There's nothing to really do about this threat of just rook to e8. If you bring the rook all the way back, we could just have rook takes bishop, and that's going to be the game. If you grab the rook, it's going to be a mate in 2. That's checkmate. So there's no other successful defense at this point. If you go in the corner, that's just going to run into either bishop takes pawn or even rook takes bishop at this point. Either one will be a very good move. Or actually, no. What am I talking about? Just bishop takes pawn is sufficient enough, and that's going to prove to be game over very soon. Pressure against this bishop twice. If you take the bishop, queen takes bishop, and then it's going to be mate next move. So rook to f7 would have ended the game much quicker, but we don't see this move. Instead, bishop to a3 is played, and as a result, we actually go on for about 35 moves where it's very difficult for black to just go ahead and keep making these defensive moves. In this next group of moves, we have essentially this a6 pawn falling and a slight regrouping of the white pieces, and this takes quite a bit of time. I'll just go ahead and show you the moves and kind of just summarize what actually ends up occurring as a direct result of all of these moves that were played. We're really not seeing any change in the pawn structure with these moves here, just a bunch of checks, some of which were played in order to meet time controls in this game, and you kind of have to be as practical as possible when you're playing the game. So far so good. We don't have any real change here until we see this h4 move. Then we have a little bit of a regrouping thing going on. The end result of all of this is going to show itself very shortly. After queen f3, bishop to f4, this bishop is starting to reposition itself. Notice not much has happened on the black side. It's just the shuffling back and forth of the queen and rook, and in some instances the black king moved. But after g3, now things are starting to show themselves. With this structure, f3, g3, h4, we have this white king now a bit more safe. It's no longer vulnerable to, let's say, diagonal checks. If this bishop were to leave the b8 to h2 diagonal, since this pawn is on g3, there's not going to be any more checks. And once the bishop lands on e3, the bishop will be conveniently watching over this f2 pawn, the base pawn of the king side structure. So finally some progress has been made by white, and now what white looks to do at this point is put pressure on the f6 pawn. So queen check, queen to f8, rook to a6, pressure against rook to a6, pressure against f6. some more shuffling going on. The queen from f6, you really just from f3 just watches over f6. This is the point to focus on. And soon enough, we have what? This point right here is we're actually very close to the end of the game. This point is very critical. We have this rook kind of just moving back and forth along this back rank. It's important not to make use of this particular square right here. If you go to d8, that's going to run into a tactic in the following way. Bishop takes on h6, and after the recapture, queen takes f6, bishop g7, rook takes bishop, queen takes rook, queen check, or queen block, queen takes queen, and we have a very simplified position, king and pawn, which is a complete win for white. That, by the way, is all forced. There's really no better continuation that black could implement. If you play your rook to d8 in this position, if you play to d8 opposed to e8 as in the game, that'll run into this tactic, which simplifies the position very well. King and pawn endgame, that's game over. So that's why we're not seeing the rook make use of this d8 square. Instead, rook e8, bishop back, rook b8, and now bishop to d4. Again, notice from this position, you don't want to make use of d8 because of that same tactic, so you really can't go to d8 to prevent that bishop from getting to d4. So rook b8, bishop d4, more pressure against f6, queen f8, queen c3, this pawn is going to fall very soon, rook e8, rook c6, queen f7, and finally that pawn falls. So this is a very, very difficult position, but now it's just really all downhill for black at this point. Now there's possibilities to check the black king along this diagonal. How the game finishes up is rook f8, we have the bishops being captured, and queen to e3. In chess, you really want to always kind of question, am I going to be better off if we exchange the queens on the board, or a pair of rooks? In this case right here, there might be the possibility that black could maybe draw the resulting just king and rook ending, and so that's why we're maybe seeing just the queens being maintained on the board. Again, keeping in mind that this king is the more vulnerable of the two kings. Let's keep the queens on the board. So queen e3, notice that it dodges the exchange of queens, but also keeps pressure on the black position. h6 is under a close eye. Queen b2, king g2, watching over f2 a second time. This runs into a pin, but white had already calculated that there's a convenient way to get out of this pin, and it happens in the following way. Queen takes on h6, hits the rook, and after queen to f7, we just have the rook coming all the way back to c2 to defend this point, and now white could actually go ahead and exchange queens at this point. A 3 versus 2 ending is most certainly going to be a win for white in a resulting king, rook, and pawn endgame. One last thing to note is that if black were to go ahead and try and win this rook with this rook to c8 move, that'll just lose tactically by way of queen to f6 check, king g8, and then queen to e6 check, followed by queen takes rook on the next turn. So that's all for this video. I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.